Hello and welcome to this special discussion where we try to make sense of what is happening in Ukraine. Ukraine, as we all know, is under attack by Russian forces, and it has been a relentless, uh, at least 2.5 days of fighting over there. So I'm joined today by a very special guest, Lieutenant General A.K. Singh. And something very interesting about his career as an Indian Armored Corps officer is that he trained under both the erstwhile USSR as well as the NATO while the Cold War was at its peak. I think we have this great opportunity to field certain questions to him to make sense of what exactly is going on between the two countries. Thank you very much, General AK, for agreeing to speak to the Quint. And I have quite a few questions. And without further ado, I would request you to give us a very brief background of what is happening.
Let me in short cover the background. While there have been tensions between Russia and Ukraine, which has been a former Soviet republic for a long time, the situation began getting out of control in early 2021. In January last year, uh, this actually was prompted by the Ukrainian President Zelensky, who urged the US President Joe Biden to let Ukraine join NATO. Now, this angered Russia, which started sending its troops near the border for training exercises in last spring and built up the momentum in autumn. By December, the US and the NATO allies started hyping up the deployment and predicting that there will be an invasion. Russia has demanded that the West gives a legally binding guarantee that NATO will not hold any military activity in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. Also, demanding that Ukraine should remain demilitarized and neutral. So, actually, if you see the background, it is again about balance of power. It is about a unipolar world versus multipolar world or a bipolar world. It's about buffer zones and it is about spheres of influence. So, in the present context, on 21st February, President Putin recognized the two breakaway regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, also known as the Donbass. And on 24th February, he invoked Para 51 of the UN Charter to move in assistance of these two republics, saying that their security was being threatened. So that is where we are. Today is the third day of the operations, and we will see how these operations have been progressing so far.
Thank you very much for this brief background. And I could hear a phone ringing in your background. So could we request for that to be put on
Yeah,
silent?
I will.
Right. General AK, since you trained um, in the Moscow Tank Academy, and that was, if I'm not wrong, if I remember it correct, it was when the Cold War was at its peak, and you have been continuously sort of been in touch with your counterparts, and I just want to understand what is the reorganization of the Russian military. What we're looking at post-war Russian military. What is the reorganization like?
Right. I think, Nishtha, that's a very pertinent question. But let me take you back to when I attended this. I was a 6-year-old young captain in 79-80, height of the Cold War. And I attended this course called Tank Troops Command and Staff course at the Malinovsky Tank Academy in the heart of Moscow. The course dealt with 70% strategy, operational art and tactics, and 30% technology. We started learning with the employment of motor rifle regiments, graduated to tank divisions, and finally the army level. The teaching largely drew from their experience in World War II, and it had been refined to face the NATO post World War II. Their employment of large forces, mainly armor and mechanized, was more a science than an art. The acme lay in build-up and launch through the designated areas in precise time. And you can see that legacy. The build-up and launch, that is what they focused on. And
Right.
it was either part of the first echelon armies, followed by the second echelon armies. And then they had a core level group called the OMG or Operational Maneuver Group that broke right through the front line and went to areas in depth to link up with Spetsnaz and airborne forces. The overall philosophy was largely vetted in massive fire preparation of the battlefield, both by RT and air, and relentless momentum thereafter. Objectives had to be achieved, casualties notwithstanding. And therefore, it came as a shock to the Russian armed forces when the Warsaw Pact actually dissolved and the Soviet Union ceased to be, and they turned into the Russian armed forces. Now, that was a very critical period where funding for the Russian armed forces was greatly reduced because of the economic hardships in Russia. And therefore, it was a period of, I would term it as reasonable chaotic conditions within the country, as also the armed forces of the Russian Union. The test of this came in 2008 when they actually went and led an offensive into Georgia.
Georgia.
And let me quote the 2008 offensive into Georgia. While overall the Russians succeeded, but any professional could make out that it was quite muddled and there was immediate chaos. And let me recount the words of their then Chief of General Staff, General Makarov, who lamented. And he says, to find a lieutenant colonel or general able to lead troops with a sure hand, you had to choose down officers one by one throughout the armed forces, because those carrier commanders in charge of paper regiments and divisions just could not resolve the tasks we had given. And therefore, this came as a big shock. And in 2008, started the overall reorganization of the armed forces under then Chief of General Staff, General Makarov. And this continued till 2008. So what they did was that they severely curtailed the strength of the Russian armed forces and brought it down from 1.6 million to almost a million. They did away with a lot of headquarters. So they cut out the div headquarters, they cut out the corps headquarters, and they had a large number of battle groups at the battalion and brigade level, which were being directly controlled by army commanders.
Right.
And there was actually quite a blowback from the armed forces and also the industry. And that led to the arrival of a new man at the helm called General Gerasimov. And he has been their Chief of General Staff for last 10 years, the longest serving Chief of General Staff in the Russian armed forces. And his arrival gave a great fillip to the armed forces. And his main advantage lay in the fact that he had the complete mandate of the political hierarchy, that is, the faith reposed in him by President Putin, who, in a televised interview soon after his formal appointment, advised him to press on with reforms and modernize the armed forces.
I would
Now,
like to ask you, General AK, here a very very small question here. So we are what you have explained so far looks like that there was. When we talk about the reorganization of Russian military, it was basically getting more and more centralized. And just like Vladimir Putin, running the show in Russia, the new general was actually running the show, and the power was vested in between these two gentlemen, Vladimir Putin and his general.
no, let me just elaborate a little
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
highlight this. You see, in the when the reforms started under General Makarov and they did away with the headquarters, Russian capability was thereafter focused on hybrid warfare of the type that they fought in Syria, of the type that they fought in Ukraine. But their conventional capability of the kind of invasion they have launched now had withered. So what General Gerasimov did was he recreated that capability. And therefore, today, the Russian armed forces are divided into four military districts, which are strategic areas. And this is the Western Military District, the Southern Military District, the Central Military District, and the Eastern Military District. And all these have a number of field armies under them. For example, the Western Military District, which is actually part of uh, the Western stance. That means the Western Military District looks after the borders with NATO, Ukraine, Belarusia, and even up in the north with the Baltic states. It has one tank army, the first guard tank army, if I'm not wrong, and two combined arms army, the 20th and the 6th. The 20th Combined Arms Army and its subordinate formations are responsible for operations against Ukraine. This
Right. Hmm.
no, just a second. This Combined Arms Army comprises of two motor rifle divisions, that is the 3rd and the 144th, and it has a number of other forces available. And you can appreciate that they have been on the border of Ukraine for many, many months and therefore were able to place all the pieces on the chessboard in the manner that they wanted.
Right. So,
One
General,
more thing.
yeah.
Yeah, let me just also say that General Gerasimov also, and in fact, it has in the Western parlance come to be known as the Gerasimov doctrine. And that doctrine talks not only of conventional operations, it brings the new generation warfare into the fold of the combined arms conflict. And in essence, they look at cyber, they look at
Yeah.
space, they look at the cognitive domain, and they feel that warfare today is not just the art of using armed forces, but using all the
Resources
capabilities
at hand. Yes.
available to a nation. For
Right.
example, diplomatic, political, everything that is
Sure.
available, underground workers. And therefore, in overall, the philosophy is the first thing is to search for a pretext to launch a military operation.
Which is
Search
exactly
for
what they did.
Yeah, to search for a pretext to launch military operation, and the pretext was that Ukraine was harming the security of Russia and was ruthless against the Russian-speaking population of those two countries which were recognized. And therefore, Russia invoked Charter 51 of the UN. And mind you, while the West is criticizing, and nobody can justify the invasion, but the West and America in particular has used various aspects of the UN Charter to invade Libya, to invade Iraq, Syria, you just name them. They've used the doctrine of preemptive defense by going into faraway places. They've used the UN resolutions in Iraq, which turned out to be false. So it is, the UN actually has provided a number of avenues for people to do what they want.
Exactly. So they have set the precedent, and other countries are following those.
Yes.
Right. General AK, my next question is, what do you think is Russia's goal here? Like, talking strictly about the military goal here. And what is
Yeah.
the strategy that it is employing?
But let me say that it is firstly, military objective can only be derived from the political objective. And in this case, you can see that the military and the political forces are hand in glove. So the political objective of Russia is very clear, and that is to keep Ukraine in its sphere of influence, keep it as a buffer, and not allow NATO to come to its doorstep. Absolutely clear. Now, how has this political objective been translated into military objective and military strategy? And the strategy, of course, is to use those two breakaway regions, which are now being recognized as independent, and going into Ukraine with the aim of regime change. And to do that, they have to attack the center of gravity, and that is Kyiv and the government of Ukraine in Kyiv. So, what strategy has unfolded? The Ukrainian armed forces, mind you, cannot be compared to the Russian armed forces, but they are a considerable number and well equipped by the West. Bulk of them were actually facing Russia towards the east, the eastern border. So what the Russians have done is they went into Ukraine from the east, which was the most expected route, that is Luhansk, Donetsk, Kharkiv, Sumy, and those areas.
Yeah.
But they did not, to my reading, did not press on the attacks too seriously to avoid casualties. Their main thrusts actually came from the north, that is through Belarusia,
Belarus.
where two thrusts moved in straight to Kyiv. Kyiv is less than 200 kilometers, 160 kilometers. One from northwest, one from northeast. The shortest route to Kyiv bypassed Chernobyl and now are on the outskirts of Kyiv. Similarly, from the south, that is from the Crimea, another thrust went up, again, not only towards Odessa, but also towards the Dnieper River. As a result, what I see unfolding as part of their grand strategy or military strategy for this operation is that they will head to Kyiv and surround it from the north and the south. Now, the Ukrainian forces that are opposing strongly in the eastern parts, their flanks will be turned by both these offensives. And shortly, they will have no other avenue except to lay down arms. So you can see the new Gerasimov doctrine unfolding, winning the war with least amount of casualties. Now, how this has unfolded is in typical Russian combined arms concept style. They had these Spetsnaz, that is, their very special forces dropping
Right.
in wide areas, basically to provide information and seek control of critical assets. This was followed by taking over of an airfield just northwest of Kyiv, where they landed their airborne forces. and simultaneously the ground operations. This was combined with cyber warfare, cyber attacks, breaking down communications everywhere. Mind you, a distinctive feature, Nishtha, that I see is a desire or an effort to reduce and minimize casualties. And
I have
therefore,
to, yeah. Sorry,
uh,
go ahead.
therefore, the typical offensive from Russia should have started with the preparation of the battlefield with massive artillery and air bombardment. That
Right,
has that has been focused only onto military targets
right,
because Russia has declared that they have no intention of staying on there, but after achieving their objectives, they will want to
right,
hand over to a friendly regime, and
right.
therefore, uh, no keeping the populace in their favor or not harming the population is a key vertical of this strategy.
Right, but generally, okay, let's talk about the cost of this war. Yes, Russia's stated goal is not to inflict unnecessary casualties on Ukraine or suffer casualties of their troops. But we know that war is unpredictable, and when you declare war, declaring war is in one's control, but not the direction that it is eventually going to take. So what, in your opinion, is going to be the likely cost of this war?
See, Nishtha, what differentiates great powers, and Russia is certainly historically and militarily, may not be one of the strongest powers economically, but militarily today it is right next to America. In nuclear field, they match the Americans. So one of the great sort of identifying factors for great powers is their ability to be able to launch uh, military forces in pursuit of objectives despite the risk of accepting casualties. And you can see the Russians specifically, though they've become much more sensitive, in the World War, they were slightly insensitive to the number of casualties, and they had 20 million casualties, 2 million casualties in the Battle of
Two,
Leningrad.
yes.
Obviously, that cannot be today. And you can see that in Afghanistan, they withdrew because of the large number of casualties. Now, in this war, though it is a full scale offensive, let me say the fact that they have focused on to the military targets. In fact, they first dominated the airspace. They they actually demolished all the air defenses and put down all the airfields, thus giving them freedom of movement. Therefore, the number of casualties that the Russians would have suffered would not be commensurate to the kind of operations they have launched.
Right,
Certainly, casualties in hundreds would be in order. I can't because inputs are difficult to come by. Information is scarce, but 400, 500, 600 casualties is something that the Russians would have certainly suffered, and they were probably prepared for that.
right,
Simultaneously, the Ukrainian armed forces would have also suffered casualties, but as is being made out, that large number of Ukrainian armed forces have actually put down their arms because the Russian side, especially the president, made an announcement that we are not fighting you. Please put down your arms and we'll allow you to go home. So that's psychological warfare. So casualties, yes, but the kind of destructive power that is available on the modern battlefield, the casualties would be restricted because of various reasons that I have explained.
right. No, but the latest information that we have got from Ukraine is the shooting down of an IL-76, and I believe some 70 Russian soldiers are said to
Yeah,
have been killed
yeah,
in that action.
it must be paratroopers, and
Yes.
when they say that they have put down all the air defenses, It's not possible to put down each and every air defense weapon. There are large number of shoulder-fired Stinger missiles available to them. And while they may not be so effective against fast-moving fighter aircraft, but against a slow-moving IL-76 kind of aircraft, well, he's got a hit, and that has caused a large number of casualties. Similarly,
Right.
you would have also seen that the Ukrainian armed forces have actually put down a number of bridges on the rivers. They have destroyed them. But
Right.
the Russian combined arms would have engineers following up, which will lay down the bridges at night. So maybe tonight you will see the rivers being bridged again. And I think I see that sooner than later, as they get hold of Kiev, I think there would be a fair chance of negotiation and end
Right.
to hostilities, because both sides have indirectly, they are sparring, but indirectly they are talking of coming on the negotiating table. But I think
Right.
without a regime change in Ukraine, Russia's objectives would not be met, and therefore
Correct.
they will keep talking. They will go for a regime change.
Right. What explains the NATO's response so far? I mean, it is baffling to a lot of people who have reposed a lot of trust in organizations like the United Nations and NATO. Cynics like me would always be, would always be taking all this bonhomie and backslapping culture of such organizations with a pinch of salt. But a lot of countries and Ukraine clearly put a lot of trust in NATO's support. Where is NATO?
Yeah, Nishtha, they say that people at top level must read lessons of history. And if the Ukrainian president had read the lessons from the Russia Georgian War of 2008, he would have been quite clear that NATO is not going to step in. Georgia made the mistake of depending on American and NATO intervention, even though they were not a part of NATO when the Russians went in. And obviously, the NATO will not intervene. Unlikely to intervene in a non NATO country against a main rival like Russia. Russia is a very powerful military machine. One. Secondly, it is one of the superpowers as far as nuclear capability goes. And if NATO gets involved in Ukraine by putting boots on ground, they are risking a flare up which will become uncontrollable. But the
Right.
moot point is that there was, I think, partly the West should also be blamed to some extent. When they goaded Ukraine or the Ukrainian president, he had not yet been accepted into NATO. It was still further away. And yet, I am not sure on what premise did he base that he will hold Russia if an
Yeah.
invasion takes place. So I think there was total misreading, and the Russians, of course, read the situation very well, and they also announced, if you recollect, that President Putin warned that if anyone interferes and comes into this conflict zone, we will punish you in a manner that you couldn't have imagined. So I
Right.
think also NATO is a large number of countries, each has its own interests, and there is, let me say, very little stomach for a direct conflict with a powerful country like Russia.
And I
You
think I
know,
think Russia read the room, General AK, after the US just
Afghanistan.
abandoned Afghanistan. So I think Russia read the room clearly that there is no appetite for a direct confrontation.
There is a saying that you must speak softly and carry a big stick. Yeah, there is no point shouting at the rooftops and then not carrying enough clout in your hand. So I think this will give let me say, India has been quite neutral, which is how it should be. But if
I disagree here, General Lake. Just give me like 15 seconds here. Because the
yeah,
UNSC, yeah, the UNSC vote happened last night and India has abstained. So would you see this as neutrality? Or because abstention also means something, it is also making a political statement because China abstained and the UAE abstained. We are in that group right now.
uh, you are now coming to the lessons. Let me say, what are the choices for India? To condemn the Russian attack, and then what? Who will come to hold your hand? The same people who are now saying, and this is what our foreign secretary mentioned in the Quad meeting or later, he said that look, when the Chinese were, in Ladakh confronting us, everybody called for lowering of tensions and getting to negotiation, and that's what India has done. See, India, Russia has been a great friend of India, has supported us in many, many critical situations. Even today, our defense relationship, while growing with all other countries, is very, very specifically bound to the Russian military and their armament industry. And therefore, the China factor also looms large. Now, you don't want to create a situation depending on the West and taking a position which is against Russia. So I think it's a difficult choice that the foreign ministry and the political establishment had to make. And I think what would have guided them would have been the national interest of India more than anything else.
There are two questions that I want to quickly take up. One is by a user called I think Prajesh has raised two questions on YouTube, saying what kind of action from Russia's side can actually provoke NATO to take action.
Uh, you see, if you, I mean, we don't have a map here, but if you look at the ring of countries of all NATO, starting from the Baltic, coming down
Yeah,
to Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, coming down
right.
to Moldova, Turkey, down south, there is a ring of NATO countries around Belarusia, around Russia, Belarusia, Ukraine. Okay. And now they have made a strong statement by beefing up their forces in these parts, okay, by sending additional troops, deploying additional weapons. Uh, some airspace has been closed. I just read that by one or two countries.
Yes.
Uh, Russia at the moment is not interested in getting into a confrontation with NATO. Its objectives are in Ukraine. And here also you would see that bulk of the forces of the Russia have been actually focused towards Kiev and east of the Dnieper River. So
Right.
basically, you see, Ukraine gets divided into two parts, the
Right.
eastern part and the western part. So the
Right.
western part, there is no conflict happening. At the moment, Russia has focused to expand the Donbass region, come from the north to Kiev, and from the south create a land bridge which will take them to Odessa and then
Yeah.
link up to the Donbass region. So they
Right.
are creating a situation where even after peace comes in, Russia will retain a strategic
Yes.
foothold in the eastern and southern part of Ukraine. I do not see a conflict happening between Russia and NATO.
Right. And what do you think of the speculation that this doesn't bode well for Taiwan? Because China may want to do something similar, may try to
Yeah,
pull a similar stunt there.
yeah, Taiwan has taken a position in criticizing Russia and
Yes.
condemning Russia, and that's a bold move. And see, the Chinese objectives are clear. Taiwan's reunification is top of the chart, but they are ready to wait patiently. And I think they are hoping that over a period of time, the Western countries and Taiwan itself will realize that there is no other choice.
Right.
Because the invasion of Taiwan, even though it's a very small country, will be costly. And China at the moment doesn't want to use force. Though,
Right.
mind you, they have not shied away from saying that ultimately they will reunify it through aggression if required. Also, the Americans have been very ambiguous about the fact that will they come directly into the conflict if it happens between China and Taiwan. But your point is valid that China has now, with this action, the focus of the Americans and the NATO and the Western allies has shifted to Europe, which was earlier focused in the Indo Pacific. And
Right.
that's also a little worrying for a country like India. You
Yes.
see,
What are
with
the
our,
lessons here for us, General AK? Now that you mention India.
let me say, the lessons are both politico strategic and military. The first political strategic lesson that I think people in high places would draw or their perceptions will get reinforced is you have to fight your own wars.
Right.
Nobody comes to your aid unless their national interest demands. And therefore, there is no substitute other than to empower your armed forces. That is the first lesson that should come out. And I think uh, I would specifically mention, though it may not be so much in context, that India will have to certainly increase the amount of money that we are putting down in the defense budget. Because if you do a comparative analysis of what China has and what we have, we face two hostile neighbors, China and Pakistan. And we face the threat of a collusive threat from both these countries. And we have to be prepared. There is no other way. That's the first lesson. Second lesson is that the Indian armed forces, especially the Indian Army, are sustained focus on counterinsurgency operations and on proxy war has diluted our conventional focus. I use my words very carefully. Has diluted our focus on conventional capability, and this came to light when the Chinese moved in. There were large amount of shortages that we could see. Of course, our reaction was very firm, and we were able to stall the Chinese without allowing them to move in further. But in future, the next conflict with China may not be conventional. It may be indirect, it may be based on cyber, it may be based on missile precision strikes, so it may be based on non contact warfare. And we have to build up those capabilities. Against Pakistan, not because I'm a tank man or a cavalry officer, there was a little, it was fashionable to say that the days of the tank men, of the artillery, of others in the conventional field were over. Please see, when the Chinese moved in into Ladakh, their forces were led by their tanks.
By the
And today,
tanks, yeah.
today, we have a large number of our own armored forces, I will not recount them, in Ladakh to bolster our defense. Similarly, on the plains, if it comes to that and Pakistan has to be taught a lesson sometime, you will have to rely on your combined arms capability. So that's the second lesson. We have to refocus ourselves on our main task, that is the conventional role of the Indian armed forces. And, the, and this also applies, Nishtha, to our leadership. A
Right.
large, a large number of our very senior officers have grown to those exalted ranks only with the experience of counter-insurgency operations.
I think that's a problem. And where you talked about the reorganization of the Russian military, I think similar kind of reorganization to bolster the conventional capabilities
But
required.
But let me say, this has caught the attention of the hierarchy. And
Mhm.
today, let me just say, we have a thoroughbred infantry officer commanding the armored division. And we have armored corps officers commanding formations in Kashmir. So a cross pollination is going on. We have to prepare our leadership for all kinds of situations. And I think the hierarchy is seized with this serious problem. Third thing, we have to induct a large number of instruments which find a place in the new generation warfare. I'm talking of
Right.
cyber, I'm
Cyber.
talking of precision missile strikes, I'm talking of space warfare, I'm talking of psychological warfare, I'm talking of the cognitive domain. So, while we bolster our conventional, traditional capabilities, we have to bring all these to bear so that we are prepared for the new generation warfare that may be unleashed against us. And the last lesson which you can draw, Nishtha, not only from this, but from all professional militaries around the world, United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France, China, Russia, they are all integrated, joint. We are one of the few exceptions who still live in our own silos of Army, Navy, Air Force. And
Right.
while the Honorable Prime Minister has given a clear directive that we need to integrate, and the thinking and the push had started, but unfortunately, with the sad demise of our CDS, General
Yeah.
Rawat, who was personally giving it a big push, a slight status quo approach has appeared. But I think as soon as the government appoints the new CDS, his charter will be very clear to go for integration. We should have done
Right.
it yesterday, and I think we cannot delay it any longer. That's from
Right. Right, General AK, one last question, but last but not the least, as they say. And do you think that India is handling this situation uh, very well, diplomatically speaking? We do not have
uh,
any stakes militarily, but diplomatically
are
speaking.
you're talking of the Russia-Ukraine situation.
The Russia-Ukraine situation, also because United States increasingly has been an ally. You know, we are part of the Quad, and there is this in, interdependence when it comes to markets.
I would just say that India needs to be guided by its own national interest. Of course, we are part of a larger committee of nations, and therefore, apart from realism, we also need to take into account a little bit of idealism. But you have to look at the complete perspective. You cannot say that ABC can do XYZ and it can be condoned. And when XYZ does ABC, well, then, so I think a balance has to be drawn. I would specifically say, um, while India has, I think our Prime Minister has stated that we are very saddened by this aggression, by the use of force and this conflict, and has called upon all the parties concerned, both the parties, to cease fighting and get on to negotiation. He has said that all issues can be solved through negotiations. Now, I think going further than this would be very difficult for India. And while there was a news that the Ukrainian ambassador appealed to the Prime Minister
Yes.
to that India must, because of its long-standing relationship with Russia, and the Prime Minister spoke to President Putin And of course, a small follow up has come out in the press, but what they spoke actually won't come out in the press totally. I think that would
Right.
have been a frank discussion. And India also has relations with Ukraine. Of course, not of the same depth that we have with Russia, but also with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. We have 19, 20,000 students in Ukraine.
Exactly. Hmm.
As far as India is concerned, we would desire that this fighting stops and that both the countries get onto the negotiating table. And if India can help in any way in moving them towards that negotiating table, I think that should be and that would be India's focus.
Right. Thank you so much, General AK, for putting things into the correct perspective and sparing time for us. Like everybody else in the world, our eyes are also glued to television screens and on mobile phones, uh, trying to get as much information as we can from ground zero. And let's just hope that this fighting between Russia and Ukraine stops.